The fire alarm screamed like a wounded animal at 3:47 a.m. I jerked awake from dreams I couldn't remember, my heart already racing before my mind caught up to what was happening. The piercing wail filled my studio apartment, bouncing off the bare walls and cheap furniture I'd never bothered to replace. For a moment, I sat frozen in bed, wondering if this was some kind of nightmare extension, but the acrid smell of smoke filtering under my door made everything brutally real. I stumbled into jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my keys and wallet, and rushed into the hallway. The building's ancient fire alarm system was shrieking from every floor, creating a symphony of panic that made thinking impossible. Other residents were emerging from their apartments in various states of undress and confusion. Mrs. Chen from 4B clutching her cat carrier, the college students from down the hall looking hungover and annoyed. That's when I saw him. He was standing outside apartment 3A directly across from mine, wearing nothing but gray sweatpants and a white tank top that clung to a frame I tried not to notice. His dark hair was mussed from sleep, and there was something almost vulnerable about seeing him this way, unguarded, unprepared. In the 3 years I'd lived here, we'd exchanged maybe a dozen polite nods in the hallway. I knew his name was Marcus from the mailbox downstairs, knew he was older, maybe late 40s, and that he kept odd hours. Sometimes I heard classical music through our shared wall late at night, always played softly, always something melancholy. But now, in the harsh fluorescent emergency lighting, he looked lost. "Shit," he muttered, patting the pockets of his sweatpants. "Shit. Shit, shit." "What's wrong?" The words came out before I could stop them. We were all supposed to evacuate, but something about his expression made me pause. "My keys," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I heard the alarm and I grabbed nothing. My keys are inside, my phone, my wallet, everything." The building's fire alarm continued its relentless screaming. Around us, other residents were making their way toward the stairwell, following evacuation protocol. But Marcus stood frozen outside his door, staring at it like he could will it to open. "Come on," I said, surprising myself. "We need to get out of the building." "But we'll figure it out downstairs." I touched his arm, just briefly, just to guide him toward the stairs, and felt the warmth of his skin beneath the thin cotton. He was solid, real, and closer than we'd ever been before. For a moment, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or surprise that someone had noticed his panic in the midst of the chaos. We joined the stream of residents making their way down 3 flights of stairs and out into the October night. The air was crisp and sharp, cutting through my t-shirt and making me wish I'd grabbed a jacket. But Marcus, in just his tank top, had to be freezing. Outside, we discovered the source of the alarm. Mrs. Patterson in 2C had fallen asleep while cooking and set off her smoke detector. The fire department was already handling it. No real fire, just enough smoke to trigger the building's overly sensitive system. But it would be at least an hour before they cleared us to go back inside. Marcus stood on the sidewalk looking displaced, like someone who had been suddenly dropped into the wrong life. Without his usual composed demeanor, the way he carried himself when I glimpsed him in the hallway, always purposeful, always self-contained, he seemed younger, more uncertain. "This is ridiculous," he said, more to himself than to me. "I don't even know any of these people." I looked around at our fellow building residents, clustered in small groups on the sidewalk. He was right. We were all strangers who happened to share the same address. I recognized faces but couldn't name most of them. It struck me as profoundly sad, the way we could live so close to other people and remain completely isolated. "Me neither," I admitted. Marcus glanced at me, really looked at me for what might have been the first time. In the streetlight, his eyes were darker than I'd expected. Brown with flecks of gold, framed by lines that suggested he smiled more often than his serious hallway demeanor would indicate. "I'm Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "I know." The words slipped out before I could think better of them. I mean, the mailbox. I'm Evan. His handshake was firm, calloused in a way that suggested he worked with his hands. It lasted a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when he let go, I found myself missing the contact immediately. Evan. He repeated my name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Apartment 3B. I hear your music sometimes. My music? I felt heat creep up my neck. Sorry, I didn't realize it was loud enough to... It's not loud. The walls are just thin. Marcus's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. Jazz, right? Late at night. Yeah. I was mortified. All those evenings I'd thought I was invisible, just another anonymous neighbor, and he'd been listening to my soundtrack of insomnia. I have trouble sleeping sometimes. Me too. The admission hung between us, heavier than it should have been. Around us, other residents were talking in the animated way people do when ordinary routine gets disrupted. But Marcus and I seemed to exist in our own pocket of quiet, like the fire alarm had stripped away not just our sleep, but some of the careful distance we'd maintained for 3 years. Are you cold? I asked, noticing the way he'd wrapped his arms around himself. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. His lips were already starting to turn blue, and I could see goosebumps rising along his forearms. Without thinking too much about it, I pulled off my jacket and held it out to him. I can't take your jacket. You're freezing. So are you. I have long sleeves. You don't. I pushed the jacket toward him again. Just take it, please. Marcus looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he accepted the jacket, his fingers brushing against mine as he took it. The contact was brief but electric, sending a jolt of awareness through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Thank you, he said softly. Watching him put on my jacket did something strange to my chest, a tightening that felt both protective and possessive. The jacket was too small for his broader frame, but he wore it anyway, and there was something intimate about seeing him wrapped in something that belonged to me. So what do? He asked. When you're not listening to jazz at 3 a.m.? I'm a graphic designer. Freelance, mostly. I stuffed my hands in my pockets to keep from fidgeting. Pretty boring, actually. What about you? I'm a piano teacher. And a tuner. I fix them, too. That explained the calloused hands, the music through the walls. Is that why you keep such strange hours? Students? Some students, but mostly I work on pianos late at night. It's quieter then, easier to hear the subtle problems with tuning. Marcus zipped up my jacket and I tried not to think about how the fabric held the warmth of his body. Plus, I've always been a bit of a night owl. Something about the hours after midnight. Everything feels more honest then. I knew exactly what he meant. Those were my favorite hours too, when the world felt smaller and more manageable, when I could exist without the weight of other people's expectations or judgments. Is that why you were awake when the alarm went off? I asked. I was reading, actually. Old habit from when I couldn't sleep. Marcus glanced up at our building, where lights were starting to come back on as residents were cleared to return. I used to have terrible insomnia. Books were the only thing that helped. Used to? Something flickered across his face, a shadow of old pain, quickly hidden. I sleep better now. Mostly. There was a story there, layers of history I suddenly wanted to understand. But before I could ask anything else, one of the firefighters announced that the building was clear and we could go back inside. The crowd began to disperse, people drifting back toward the entrance in small groups. Marcus and I found ourselves walking together, not by design, but by some kind of magnetic pull I didn't want to examine too closely. About your keys, I said as we climbed the stairs. I might be able to help. I have some tools. Lockpicking isn't exactly legal, but building management won't be here until morning. Marcus stopped on the second-floor landing and turned to look at me. You know how to pick locks? Misspent youth. I tried to make it sound casual, but the truth was more complicated. I'd learned because I'd locked myself out so many times as a kid when my mother was working late shifts. It was easier than explaining to neighbors why a 10-year-old was sitting in the hallway at midnight. Marcus seemed to be searching for the right word. Unexpectedly useful. When we reached the third floor, I unlocked my apartment and retrieved my small toolkit. Nothing elaborate, just a basic set of picks I'd bought online years ago and rarely used. Marcus waited in the hallway, still wearing my jacket, still looking slightly displaced by the evening's events. This might take a few minutes, I warned, kneeling in front of his door. I'm not exactly an expert. Take all the time you need. There was something in his voice, gratitude, yes, but also something warmer. I focused on the lock, trying to ignore the way he was standing close enough that I could smell whatever soap he used, clean and masculine and distracting. The lock was older, simpler than modern deadbolts. After a few minutes of careful manipulation, I heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. Got it, I said, standing and turning the handle. The door swung open, and Marcus's apartment was revealed in the dim light from the hallway. Jesus, he breathed. I can't believe you actually did that. I handed him back his keys from the small table just inside his door, and our fingers brushed again in the exchange. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lingered, charged with something I wasn't ready to name. Thank you, Marcus said quietly. Really, I don't know what I would have done. Probably called a locksmith in the morning and paid way too much money. Probably. He was still standing very close, still wearing my jacket. But that's not the point. What is the point? Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying my face in the dim hallway light. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. The point is that you noticed I needed help. And you offered it, even though we barely know each other. He paused. Even though you didn't have to. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had thanked me, really thanked me, for something that mattered? When was the last time I'd felt useful to another person, necessary in some small way? It wasn't a big deal, I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. It had felt like a big deal. The whole evening had felt significant in ways I couldn't articulate. It was to me. We stood there in the hallway, the building settling back into its late-night quiet around us. I should have said goodnight, should have gone back to my own apartment and tried to salvage what remained of my sleep. But something about the way Marcus was looking at me made leaving feel impossible. I should give you back your jacket, he said, but he made no move to take it off. You should keep it for now, in case the heat's not working properly. It was a transparent excuse. The building's heating system was fine. But Marcus didn't call me on it. Instead, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look younger, less guarded. Would you? He started, then stopped himself. Never mind. It's late. What? I was going to ask if you wanted to come in for coffee, but it's almost 5 a.m., and you probably want to get some sleep. The offer hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or ignore. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was how complications started, that I barely knew this man, that getting involved with a neighbor was asking for trouble. But there was something about Marcus, the way he'd looked lost outside his apartment, the gratitude in his voice when I'd helped him, the careful way he'd said my name like it mattered, that made rationality seem less important than possibility. I don't really sleep much anyway, I heard myself saying, and I've never actually seen your apartment. Marcus's face lit up with something that looked like relief. It's not much. Pretty similar to yours, I imagine. But when he stepped aside to let me in, I discovered that his apartment was nothing like mine. Where my place was sparse and impersonal, the home of someone who had never quite figured out how to make a space feel lived in. Marcus's was warm and cluttered in all the right ways. The most striking thing was the piano, a beautiful old upright that dominated the small living room. Sheet music was scattered across its surface and stacked on nearby tables. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with volumes that looked well-read rather than decorative. The furniture was worn but comfortable, the kind of pieces that suggested a life fully inhabited. "Wow," I said, taking it all in. "This is messy? Alive." The word came out before I could think better of it. "It feels like someone actually lives here." Marcus paused in his movement toward the kitchen, turning to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What does your place feel like?" "Like a hotel room, like I'm just passing through." The admission surprised me with its honesty. I hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about Marcus's presence made the usual filters feel unnecessary. "How long have you been passing through?" he asked gently. 3 years, apparently. Maybe longer. I sat down on his couch, which immediately enveloped me in softness. I've gotten really good at living like I'm about to leave, even when I have nowhere else to go. Marcus was quiet as he moved around the small kitchen, preparing coffee with the same careful attention I imagined he brought to tuning pianos. There was something almost ritualistic about his movements, as if making coffee for another person was an act he took seriously. "I used to live like that," he said finally. "Always ready to run. It took me a long time to figure out that the problem wasn't the places I was living. It was that I was afraid to actually inhabit my own life." "What changed?" Marcus paused, his hands stilling on the coffee maker. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I got tired of being afraid all the time. Tired of pretending that keeping everyone at arm's length was the same thing as being strong." The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with a sound that was somehow both mundane and intimate. I found myself studying Marcus as he moved around the kitchen, noting the way he favored his left hand, the careful precision of his movements, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. There was something deeply attractive about watching him in his own space, seeing the person he was when he thought no one was looking. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to be comfortable in his own skin, but there were shadows in his expression that suggested the journey hadn't been easy. "How do you take your coffee?" he asked. "Black is fine." He nodded approvingly. "A purist. I like that." When he handed me the mug, our fingers touched for the 3rd time that night, and I was beginning to recognize the electric current that seemed to run between us whenever we made contact. This time, the touch lasted long enough for me to notice that his hands were warm and steady, long enough to wonder what they would feel like in other contexts. Marcus sat down on the opposite end of the couch, closer than strictly necessary, but not close enough to feel presumptuous. He tucked one leg under himself in a way that was surprisingly boyish, at odds with the mature composure he usually projected. "So," he said, cradling his coffee cup between his palms. "What keeps you up at night, Evan?" "Besides the jazz." The question was asked casually, but there was something in his tone that suggested he genuinely wanted to know. When was the last time someone had asked me a question like that? Not about what I did for work or where I was from, but about the interior landscape of my life. "Everything," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. "I have this brain that won't turn off. It just cycles through all the things I should be doing differently, all the ways I'm failing to live up to whatever it is I'm supposed to be." Marcus nodded slowly, recognition flickering in his eyes. "That sounds exhausting." "It is. That's why I listen to music so late. It's the only thing that quiets the noise in my head." "What kind of noise?" I took a sip of coffee, which was, as I was beginning to expect from Marcus, significantly better than anything I usually drank, and tried to find words for feelings I'd never really articulated before. Loneliness, mostly, but not the kind where you want to be around people. The kind where you feel isolated even when you're not alone. Like everyone else got some manual for how to be human, and I missed the distribution day. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice was soft and careful. I know that feeling. I spent years thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some essential piece missing that everyone else seemed to have. He paused, his fingers finding the handle of his coffee cup. It took me a long time to realize that the problem wasn't that I was broken. It was that I was trying to force myself into a shape that didn't fit. There was something in the way he said it, a weight of experience that suggested he wasn't speaking in generalities. I wanted to ask what shape he'd been trying to force himself into, what had changed to make him more comfortable in his own skin. But the question felt too intimate for someone I'd known for less than 2 hours. When did you figure that out? I asked instead. About 5 years ago. I was married then, had been for almost 10 years, and I thought I had everything figured out. Good job, nice house, wife who loved me. Marcus's voice took on a distant quality, like he was describing someone else's life. But I was miserable all the time, and I couldn't understand why. I had everything I was supposed to want. What happened? I met someone who showed me what it looked like to actually be yourself instead of just playing a role. Marcus's eyes found mine, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, something that looked like a confession he wasn't sure he should be making. It wasn't even romantic, just a friend who was so completely, unapologetically himself that it made me realize how much energy I was spending on being who I thought I should be instead of who I actually was. The implications of what he was saying settled over me slowly. I thought about the way he lived alone in this warm, book-filled apartment, the way he'd never mentioned an ex-wife except in past tense, the careful way he spoke about authenticity and self-acceptance. And your marriage? I asked quietly. Ended. It had to. Sarah was a wonderful person, but she deserved someone who could love her the way she needed to be loved, not someone who was just grateful for her affection and mistaking that gratitude for the real thing. Marcus's voice was heavy with old guilt. The worst part was that she knew, long before I did. She could feel me pulling away, could sense that I was somewhere else even when I was sitting right next to her. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was the best thing that ever happened to both of us, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. She's remarried now, actually, to someone who adores her properly. Marcus's smile was sad but not bitter, and I got to figure out who I actually was instead of who I thought I should be. The conversation had shifted into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary, the kind of honesty that usually took months or years to build up to. But something about the late hour, about the unusual circumstances that had brought us together, seemed to have stripped away the usual social barriers. What did that look like? Figuring out who you actually were? Marcus was quiet for so long that I wondered if he was going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. It looked like admitting that I had never been attracted to my wife the way a husband should be. It looked like acknowledging that every relationship I'd ever had with a woman felt like I was playing a part in someone else's story. He paused, his eyes finding mine in a look that was both terrifying and electric. It looked like finally being honest about what I actually wanted, even though it meant starting over completely at 43. The silence that followed was pregnant with understanding and possibility in equal measure. I could feel something shifting between us, the careful boundaries of neighbor-to-neighbor conversation giving way to something raw and real and dangerous. My hands were trembling slightly around my coffee cup, and I had the wild thought that this was what it must feel like to stand at the edge of a precipice, knowing that what happened next would determine whether you fell or learned to fly. Evan. Marcus's voice was soft, tentative. Can I ask you something? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The music you listen to late at night, is that research or recognition? The question hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. I knew that what I said next would determine whether this remained a conversation between friendly neighbors or became something else entirely, something that might change everything. I thought about Marcus's weathered hands and careful eyes, about the way he had looked lost outside his apartment and grateful when I'd helped him. I thought about the warmth of his space and the way he made coffee like it was a form of meditation. I thought about his ex-wife and the years of pretending he had described with such weary recognition. Most of all, I thought about the way he was looking at me now, not with casual neighborly interest, but with the careful hope of someone who recognized something in another person that he had been searching for without knowing it. "Recognition," I whispered. The word seemed to release something in the room's atmosphere, like a held breath finally being exhaled. Marcus's eyes closed briefly, as if he were processing the weight of what I had just told him. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked like relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with that. Thank you for asking." I set my coffee cup down with hands that were definitely shaking now. I don't think anyone ever has before. "Really?" "Really. I'm very good at hiding in plain sight." Marcus shifted on the couch, angling his body toward mine. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "I spent 10 years hiding in plain sight," he said. "Married to a woman I cared about deeply but wasn't in love with, living in a house that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within. I was so good at it that I almost convinced myself it was real." "What made you stop?" "I realized that the life I was living was killing something essential inside me, that all the energy I was putting into being acceptable was energy I could have been putting into being alive." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "And I decided that being alone and authentic was better than being partnered and invisible to myself." The honesty in his voice was staggering. I found myself thinking about my own years of hiding, the careful way I had constructed a life that looked normal from the outside while feeling hollow within. The difference was that Marcus had actually had the courage to tear it all down and start over. "Are you," I asked, "better off alone?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. When he spoke again, there was something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. "I was. Until tonight, I thought loneliness was just the price of authenticity." He paused, and I could see him gathering courage for whatever he was going to say next. "But now I'm wondering if maybe the real price of authenticity is just waiting for someone else who's brave enough to pay it too." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were exactly what I hadn't known I needed to hear. All those nights listening to jazz alone in my apartment, all those years of feeling like I was observing life rather than living it. Maybe it hadn't been meaningless isolation. Maybe it had been preparation. "Marcus," I started, then stopped, not sure what I was trying to say. "I know," he said softly. "This is crazy. We barely know each other. You came here because of a fire alarm, not because you were looking for whatever this is. What is this?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, too direct and honest and fraught with possibility. But Marcus didn't seem alarmed by the question. If anything, he looked relieved that one of us had finally asked it. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that I haven't felt this awake in years. I know that talking to you feels like the first real conversation I've had since my divorce. I know that when you picked that lock for me, it felt like you were picking the lock on something much more significant." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings. Too fast, too complicated, too many ways this could go wrong. But there was another voice underneath the panic, quieter but more insistent, saying that this was the first time in years I had felt truly present in my own life. "I don't know how to do this," I said honestly. I've never, I mean, I've known, but I've never actually acted on it. Neither have I, Marcus said softly. Not in a way that mattered. Not with someone who mattered. The admission created a space between us that felt both terrifying and safe. We were both beginners here, both trying to figure out how to translate years of hidden longing into something real and present. I looked at Marcus's face in the soft lamplight, at the way his eyes held a mixture of hope and fear that probably matched my own. I thought about the fire alarm that had brought us together, about my jacket that he was still wearing, about the careful way he had made coffee for 2 people instead of 1. I should probably go, I said, but I made no move to leave. You should, Marcus agreed, but his voice was full of disappointment. We sat there in the heavy silence, both of us knowing that I should leave and neither of us wanting me to. The evening had already crossed so many lines, had moved from strangers helping with a lockout to something approaching confession. One more step would take us somewhere we couldn't come back from. I was still trying to find the courage to either leave or stay when Marcus spoke again, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. The words hung in the air between us like a question that would change everything, no matter how I answered it. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every choice that had led me to this moment, this apartment, this conversation, this man who looked at me like I was worth seeing. The night stretched ahead of us, full of possibility and danger in equal measure, and I realized that whatever happened next would change everything, not just between us, but in the careful, contained life I had spent so long building around my loneliness. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story, Part 2. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. The words lingered in the air between us like smoke, delicate and ephemeral, yet somehow heavy with possibility. Marcus stood in his doorway, one hand still gripping the frame as if anchoring himself, the other hanging loose at his side. The hallway light cast shadows across his face, making the lines around his eyes deeper, more pronounced. There was something vulnerable in his expression, a careful hope mixed with resignation, as if he'd already prepared himself for me to say no. My heart hammered against my ribs. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity, each drop a tiny percussion in the symphony of this moment. I could hear it even from the hallway, that steady rhythm that seemed to echo the uncertainty pulsing through my veins. I stood frozen at the threshold, one foot already crossed into the corridor, my body caught between 2 worlds. Behind me lay everything familiar. My apartment, my routine, the carefully constructed life where I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. Ahead of me stretched the unknown, represented by this man whose loneliness had somehow awakened something in me I didn't even know existed. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with unspoken questions. What did staying mean? What was I agreeing to by stepping back across that threshold? And why did every cell in my body seem to be screaming at me to turn around, to choose the unknown over the safe? I started, then stopped, the words catching in my throat like fish bones. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been thinking about him constantly since our first conversation? That his stories about distant cities and lost loves had kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what it would be like to be the subject of such tender remembrance? Marcus seemed to sense my internal struggle. His grip on the doorframe loosened slightly, and he took a small step back, giving me space to breathe, space to choose. The storm's getting worse, he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. It was an offering, an excuse I could take if I needed one. We both knew I had an umbrella, that a little rain wasn't going to hurt me, but he was giving me a way to stay without having to examine too closely why I wanted to. I looked down the hallway toward my own door, just 20 feet away but feeling like miles. My apartment waited for me there, silent and orderly exactly as I'd left it. The same books on the nightstand, the same half-empty coffee cup in the sink, the same life that had felt perfectly adequate until 3 weeks ago when Marcus had first invited me in and shown me what real loneliness looked like. "It is," I agreed, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. I turned back to face him, and something in his expression, hope flickering like candlelight, fragile and precious, made my decision for me. Maybe I should wait it out. Relief flooded Marcus's features, so swift and complete that it took my breath away. Had he really thought I might leave? Had he been preparing himself for another evening alone, another night of moving through his apartment like a ghost haunting his own life? "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. "Come in, please." I crossed back over the threshold, and the simple act felt monumental, like stepping across a bridge I might never be able to cross back over. The door closed behind me with a soft click that seemed to seal us into this moment, this choice, this terrifying possibility. His apartment felt different now, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Every object seemed more vivid, more present. The leather armchair where he'd been sitting when I arrived, the stack of books on the coffee table with their worn spines and dog-eared pages, the way the lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. I was hyper-aware of everything, the sound of our breathing, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with coffee, and something indefinably warm, the way the floorboards creaked slightly under our feet. "Can I get you something?" Marcus asked, his hands hovering uncertainly at his sides. "Coffee, or tea, or I think I have some wine." "Wine sounds good," I said, grateful for something to fill the silence, to give both of us something to do with our hands while we figured out what came next. He nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the storm and my racing thoughts. I found myself drawn to the window, watching the water stream down the glass in rivulets that caught and scattered the streetlight below. The city beyond was a blur of amber and shadow, the familiar streets transformed into something mysterious and new by the rain. How had I gotten here? 3 weeks ago, Marcus had been nothing more than a polite nod in the hallway, a face I recognized but didn't know, a neighbor who kept to himself, who seemed content with his solitude. Now, standing in his living room while he opened wine in the kitchen, I felt like I was balanced on the edge of a precipice, 1 foot already in the air. "I wasn't sure if you preferred red or white," Marcus said, returning with 2 glasses of deep burgundy liquid. "This is a Malbec from Argentina." I picked it up after I spent a month in Buenos Aires a few years ago. Our fingers brushed as he handed me the glass, and the contact sent a jolt through me that was entirely disproportionate to its innocence. If Marcus noticed my reaction, he didn't show it, but I caught the way his breath hitched slightly, the way his gaze lingered on my face for just a moment too long. "Thank you," I murmured, taking a sip. The wine was excellent, rich and smooth, with notes of dark fruit and something earthier, more complex. It warmed me from the inside out, loosening the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. We settled onto the couch, not quite side by side, but closer than mere acquaintances should sit. The space between us felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Marcus cradled his wine glass in both hands, staring down into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "I'm sorry if this is awkward," he said after a moment, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him over the rain. I don't have people over very often." The admission hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was surprising, I'd sensed his isolation from the beginning, but because of the careful way he said it, as if he were confessing to some fundamental failing rather than simply stating a fact about his life. "It's not awkward," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Not for me, anyway." He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I felt exposed under his gaze, like he could see straight through to all the confusion and longing I was trying so hard to hide. Isn't it? Being here with me, a man you barely know, while your life waits for you just down the hall. The question was loaded with more weight than a simple inquiry about comfort levels. I could hear the deeper questions beneath it. What are you doing here? What do you want from me? What are we pretending this is? I took another sip of wine, buying myself time I knew wouldn't help. How could I explain that yes, this was awkward, but that the awkwardness felt necessary somehow? That sitting here with him, trying to navigate this strange new territory of connection and desire, felt more real than anything I'd experienced in years? Maybe a little, I admitted, but not in a bad way. More like when you're about to do something important and scary, and your whole body is buzzing with nerves, but you know you have to do it anyway. Marcus's mouth curved into the faintest smile. And what is it you think you have to do? I met his eyes, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. I don't know yet, but I know I couldn't leave. Not tonight. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges that made him look younger despite the silver threading through his dark hair. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that admission settling between us like a physical thing. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, the rain coming down in sheets now, turning the windows opaque with water. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, sheltered here together while everything else washed away. I used to hate nights like this, Marcus said suddenly, his gaze turning toward the window. When I was younger, storms made me feel trapped. All that energy in the air, all that noise, and nowhere to go but deeper into yourself. He paused, swirling the wine in his glass. But I've grown to appreciate them. There's something honest about storms. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. I followed his gaze to the rain-streaked glass, thinking about his words. What changed? Why do you like them now? I learned that sometimes being forced to stay still is exactly what you need, he said softly. Sometimes the world has to trap you with someone before you're brave enough to really see them. The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. Was he talking about tonight? About us? Or was this just another piece of the philosophy he'd developed during all those years of solitude? You talk like someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about loneliness, I said, immediately wincing at how clinical it sounded. But Marcus didn't seem offended. If anything, his smile deepened. I have, he admitted. When you spend as much time alone as I do, you get acquainted with all sorts of feelings you might otherwise avoid. He glanced at me sideways. What about you? Are you comfortable with solitude? The question caught me off guard, probably because I'd never really examined it before. Was I comfortable being alone? I'd always prided myself on my independence, on not needing anyone else to feel complete. I had my work, my hobbies, my carefully curated social life that consisted mostly of casual acquaintances and professional relationships. It had felt like enough, like a life well lived. But sitting here, in the warm glow of Marcus's living room with rain painting patterns on the windows, I realized that maybe what I'd called contentment had really been resignation. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking through my own life, going through the motions of living without ever really feeling alive. I thought I was, I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them. I've always been good at being by myself. I have my routines, my interests. I thought that was enough. But I met his eyes, seeing my own uncertainty reflected there. But lately, I've been wondering if being good at something and actually enjoying it are the same thing. Marcus nodded as if I'd articulated something he'd been thinking about for years. I know that feeling, he said. For a long time, I convinced myself that solitude was a choice, that I preferred it. But if I'm being honest... He paused, taking a careful sip of his wine. I think I was just afraid of wanting more and not being able to have it. The admission hung between us, vulnerable and brave in equal measure. I wanted to ask what he'd wanted that he couldn't have, what dreams he'd abandoned or desires he'd pushed aside. But something about the careful way he'd phrased it told me he wasn't ready for those questions yet. Instead, I found myself sharing something I'd never told anyone. When I was a kid, maybe 8 or 9, my family lived next door to this old man named Mr. Chen, I said, the memory surfacing unbidden. He was probably in his 70s, lived alone, kept to himself. My parents always said he was antisocial, that he liked being by himself. But I used to see him sometimes, standing at his kitchen window, just watching our family have dinner. And he always looked so... I searched for the right word. Hungry. Not for food, but for connection. For belonging to something. Marcus was listening intently, his dark eyes focused entirely on me. It was both unnerving and intoxicating, having someone's complete attention like that. One day I saw him fall in his driveway, I continued. Nothing serious, just slipped on some ice. But when I ran over to help him up, he was so grateful, so surprised that someone had noticed, that someone cared enough to check on him. And I realized that my parents were wrong. He wasn't antisocial. He was just lonely. And he'd gotten so used to being lonely that he'd forgotten how to ask for anything else. I took a shaky breath, surprised by how much the memory still affected me. I've thought about him a lot over the years, about how easy it is to mistake survival for contentment, to convince yourself that you don't need what everyone else seems to have. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. What happened to him? He died about 2 years later, I said. Heart attack. Alone in his house. It took 3 days before anyone realized he was gone. The weight of that revelation settled between us like a stone dropped into still water. I hadn't meant to bring the mood down so dramatically, but something about Marcus's honesty had unlocked a part of me I usually kept carefully guarded. I'm sorry, I said quickly. That's not exactly cheerful conversation. Don't apologize, Marcus said firmly, leaning forward to set his wine glass on the coffee table. Thank you for telling me. It means something that you'd share that with me. As he leaned forward, the space between us seemed to shrink, and suddenly I could smell his cologne more distinctly, something warm and woody that made me want to move closer. When he settled back against the couch, he was nearer than before, near enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the way his pulse jumped in the hollow of his throat. Can I tell you something? He asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I used to think I had time, he said. Time to figure things out, time to take chances, time to stop being afraid of what other people might think. But listening to you tonight, thinking about your Mr. Chen, I realize that time isn't guaranteed, and I don't want to wake up one day and realize I spent my whole life waiting for permission to live it. My heart was racing so fast I felt lightheaded. What are you saying? Marcus held my gaze, and I saw something raw and vulnerable there, something that made my breath catch in my throat. I'm saying that having you here tonight talking like this, it's the most alive I've felt in years, and I know that probably sounds pathetic or desperate or... It doesn't, I interrupted, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. It doesn't sound pathetic at all. Relief flooded his features, and something else. Hope, maybe, or recognition. As if he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. The storm outside seemed to have reached its peak, the rain now coming down in torrents that made the windows rattle in their frames. But inside, the world had narrowed to just this. The space between us on the couch, the way the lamplight played across Marcus's face, the electricity that seemed to crackle in the air every time our eyes met. I need you to know something, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. This, you being here, us talking like this, it matters to me. More than it probably should, more than is probably wise, but I can't pretend it doesn't. The honesty in his voice, the careful vulnerability of the words, hit me like a physical force. I set my wine glass down with hands that weren't quite steady, my mind racing. Every rational thought was telling me to be careful, to think about the implications, to consider what would happen tomorrow or next week. But louder than all of that was something deeper, more primal, a voice that was telling me this moment was precious, that some things were worth the risk. It matters to me too, I said, the words tumbling out before I could lose my nerve. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that first night you invited me in for coffee. I keep finding excuses to leave my apartment at the same time as you, hoping we might run into each other. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, and I saw wonder flicker across his features like candlelight. Really? Really, I confirmed, feeling lighter now that the admission was out in the open. I don't usually... I fumbled for the words, frustrated by my inability to articulate the complexity of what I was feeling. You don't usually what? Marcus asked gently, shifting slightly closer to me on the couch. I don't usually feel like this, I said finally. About anyone. But especially not about. I gestured vaguely between us, encompassing everything. The age difference, the fact that he was a man, the complete upending of everything I'd thought I knew about myself. About men? Marcus supplied quietly, his voice free of judgment. I nodded, grateful that he'd said it so I didn't have to. I've always dated women. I thought I had it all figured out, you know. I thought I knew who I was. I laughed, but it came out shaky. Apparently not. Marcus reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't move, his fingers brushed against my hand where it rested on the couch between us. The contact was electric, sending shivers up my arm and making my breath catch. Identity isn't always fixed, he said softly, his thumb tracing gently across my knuckles. Sometimes it's more like a river. Always moving, always changing, always flowing towards something new. His touch was so gentle, so careful, as if I were something precious that might break. Sometimes you don't know where the river is taking you until you're already there. The metaphor, combined with the tenderness of his touch, nearly undid me completely. I'd spent weeks agonizing over labels and categories, trying to fit this new feeling into a box I understood. But Marcus was offering me a different way of thinking about it. Not as a fundamental change in who I was, but as a discovery, an expansion, a willingness to let myself be carried towards something I'd never imagined wanting. Is that what this is? I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain. The river carrying me somewhere new? Marcus's smile was soft and sad and beautiful all at once. I don't know, he admitted. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel like maybe I'm not stuck in the same place anymore. Like maybe I'm moving towards something better. The honesty in his voice broke something open in my chest, flooding me with tenderness and want, and a fierce protectiveness I didn't fully understand. Without thinking, I turned my hand over so our palms could touch, threading our fingers together. His hand was warm and slightly rough, real and solid and perfect in mine. We sat like that for a moment, hands intertwined, both of us staring down at the connection like it was something miraculous. And maybe it was. Maybe every human connection was a small miracle, two separate souls choosing to reach toward each other across the vast loneliness of existence. I'm scared, I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. Of what? Marcus asked, his free hand coming up to rest on my arm, his touch gentle and grounding. Of this. Of what it means. of what happens when the storm ends, and we have to go back to being neighbors who nod politely in the hallway. I looked up at him, letting him see all the uncertainty in my eyes. Of how much I want this, even though I don't understand it. Marcus squeezed my hand gently, his thumb tracing patterns across my skin. "Can I tell you a secret?" I nodded. "I'm terrified too," he said. "I'm scared that I'm reading this all wrong, that I'm projecting 20 years of loneliness onto something that's just friendship. I'm scared that I'm too old for you, too set in my ways, too damaged by all the years I spent convincing myself I didn't need anyone." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm more scared of letting you walk out that door and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing away every last bit of my resistance. This beautiful, complicated, lonely man was offering me his heart, his vulnerability, his hope for something better than the solitude we'd both grown accustomed to. And I realized that despite all my fear, despite all the uncertainty about what this meant for my future, I wanted to be brave enough to meet him halfway. Instead of speaking, I acted on pure instinct, leaning closer to him on the couch. He went very still, his eyes searching my face for any sign that I was about to pull away. When I didn't, when I continued moving closer until our knees were touching, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, his breath hitched audibly. "Is this okay?" I whispered, my free hand coming up to rest against his chest. I could feel his heart hammering beneath my palm, nearly as fast as my own. "Yes," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "God, yes." His hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing gently across my skin. The touch was reverent, careful, like I was something precious that might disappear if handled too roughly. I leaned into the contact, letting my eyes drift closed, overwhelmed by the simple pleasure of being touched with such tenderness. "You're shaking," Marcus observed softly. I opened my eyes to find him watching me with such gentle concern that it nearly broke my heart. "So are you." He glanced down at his hand where it rested against my face, and I could see the slight tremor in his fingers. "Terrified," he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. The shared admission of our mutual fear somehow made everything easier. We were both scared, both uncertain, both stepping into uncharted territory. But we were doing it together, and that made all the difference. I leaned forward until our foreheads were almost touching, until I could feel his breath against my lips, until the space between us was measured in heartbeats rather than inches. "I want to kiss you," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could lose my nerve. Marcus's eyes fluttered closed, and I felt rather than saw his smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Then why are you waiting?" He opened his eyes to look directly into mine. "Because I wanted to be sure it was what you wanted too. I wanted it to be your choice." The thoughtfulness of it, the respect implicit in waiting for my consent, made my chest ache with affection. This man, this beautiful, careful, lonely man, was giving me the space to want him on my own terms, in my own time. It was a gift I hadn't known I needed, and it made me want him even more. "It is what I want," I said firmly, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. "It's what I want, more than anything." I closed the last few inches between us, pressing my lips gently to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like wine and something uniquely him that I wanted to memorize. For a moment, we just stayed like that, lips barely touching, breathing each other's air, both of us afraid to deepen the kiss and break whatever spell was holding us together. Then Marcus made a small sound, part sigh, part moan, and suddenly everything changed. His hand tightened in my hair, and I pressed closer to him, our joined hands squeezing tight as our mouths moved together with increasing need. It was nothing like kissing a woman. His stubble was rough against my skin, his jaw broader, his body solid and masculine in a way that should have felt foreign, but instead felt like coming home. Every nerve ending was on fire, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. I could taste the wine on his tongue, smell his cologne mixed with something earthier and more primal, hear the small sounds of pleasure he was making against my mouth. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, our foreheads still pressed together. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy, and Marcus's hand was still tangled in my hair like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. "Wow," I breathed, the word inadequate for what I was feeling, but the only thing my brain could manage. Marcus laughed, the sound shaky and breathless and full of wonder. My thoughts exactly. He pulled back slightly to look at me, his thumb tracing my bottom lip with reverent gentleness. "Are you okay? Was that what you expected?" "Better," I said honestly, leaning into his touch. "So much better than I could have imagined." Relief flooded his features, and he smiled that soft, vulnerable smile that made my heart skip beats. I was terrified I was going to mess it up. It's been a long time since I've kissed anyone who mattered this much." The admission made my chest tighten with emotion. "How long?" Marcus looked embarrassed. "Longer than I care to admit. Years, probably." I leaned forward and kissed him again, softer this time, trying to pour all my tenderness and acceptance into the contact. When I pulled back, his eyes were wide with something like awe. "Well, you're a natural," I told him, smiling at the way he blushed at the compliment. We settled back against the couch, closer now than we'd been before, Marcus's arm coming around my shoulders to pull me against his side. I fit against him perfectly, my head finding the hollow between his shoulder and his collarbone, my hand resting on his chest where I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the driving rain settling into a gentler patter against the windows. But I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on this. The warmth of Marcus's body against mine, the way his fingers traced idle patterns on my shoulder, the soft sound of our breathing synchronizing in the quiet room. "What happens now?" I asked softly, voicing the question that had been hovering at the edge of my consciousness since the moment our lips first met. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on my shoulder. "I don't know," he said finally. "I wish I had some grand plan, some roadmap for navigating this, but the truth is, I'm as lost as you are." I tilted my head up to look at him. "Is that a bad thing?" He met my eyes, and I saw something hopeful flickering there. Maybe not. Maybe being lost together is better than being found alone. The simplicity of the statement hit me like a revelation. All my life, I'd been so focused on having things figured out, on knowing exactly where I was going and how I was going to get there. But maybe some journeys were meant to be taken without a map. Maybe some discoveries could only be made in the dark. "I like that," I said, settling back against his chest. "Being lost together." Marcus's arm tightened around me, and I felt him press a soft kiss to the top of my head. "Stay," he whispered, the word so quiet I almost missed it. "Please, just for tonight. We don't have to figure anything out. We don't have to make any decisions or promises. Just stay." The raw need in his voice undid me completely. This wasn't about sex or seduction, it was about connection, about two lonely souls finding comfort in each other's presence. It was about not wanting to face the darkness alone. "Okay," I said simply. "I'll stay." I felt the tension leave his body at my words, as if he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. We lay like that in comfortable silence, listening to the rain and to each other's breathing. Gradually, the events of the evening began to catch up with me. The emotional intensity, the wine, the warmth of Marcus's embrace. It all combined to make me drowsy despite the magnitude of what had just happened between us. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself drifting in that peaceful space between waking and sleeping. Marcus seemed to sense my growing sleepiness because his hand began stroking gently through my hair, the rhythmic motion impossibly soothing. "Sleep," he murmured against my temple. "I'll be here when you wake up." The promise settled into my bones like warmth, like safety, like something I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. As consciousness began to slip away, I felt Marcus pull a soft throw blanket over both of us, tucking it carefully around my shoulders. The last thing I was aware of before sleep claimed me was the sound of his heartbeat beneath my ear, steady and strong and real. Tomorrow would bring questions and complications and the harsh light of day to examine what we'd started. But for now, there was just this: the rain outside, the warmth of his embrace, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd found something worth staying for. In the growing quiet of the storm's aftermath, we fell asleep together on his couch, two people who'd spent too many nights alone finally finding solace in each other's arms. And if the future remained uncertain, if the morning would bring doubts and fears and 1,000 reasons to retreat back into our separate loneliness, well, that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, we had this. Tonight, we had each other. And for now, that was enough.